understand.
Okay, you can go now. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Janet Watson. I'm so sorry for our delay. I'm here along with my colleague, Irvin Torres. We are from the Community Technical Assistance Center and Managed Care Technical Assistance Center of New York State. This is our third webinar in our new series called Shattering Walls. This series was created by our clinical team here at CTAC, and we began to identify areas that we wanted to bring more awareness to. This area of sexual violence, abuse, and agency are important topics for us to continue to explore and to discuss and respond to. We know many of you encounter survivors of sexual abuse and violence, or unfortunately both. This series aims to build more awareness around sexual abuse and violence and provide perspective and information about resources and best practices for our providers who work with clients who may have experienced or experiencing sexual abuse, violence, or assault. In this series, we will focus on general awareness and overview, a survivor experience, the male perspective, community-based interventions, and conclude with best practices. Our presenter today is going to focus on childhood sexual abuse and male perspective. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you'll know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portions of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box features, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, click the dialog bubble on the right top toolbar and it should appear. In order to ensure that we are able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. We are so very excited to have with us today Mr. Dennis O'Brien Tyson. Once again, we thank you for joining us.
Ready? Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dennis O. Tyson. I'm the Executive Director and the President and CEO of the O'Brien Dennis Initiative. I've been working in social services for the past 10 years and roughly about 15 years doing research on understanding male sex abuse. And it's a pleasure doing this presentation on understanding childhood sex abuse of boys and men. We go ahead. First slide. An overview. This webinar will present information about the experience of childhood sex abuse of boys and men. The varying types of sex abuse will be explored, as well as dispelling myths about childhood sex abuse and perpetrators. Special attention will be given to the ripple effects of childhood sexual abuse, how boys and men respond differently than females, and how the cycle of victims to abuser can occur. There will be a discussion about the merit of interventions that promote recovery from the trauma of childhood sex abuse and how providers can optimize their ability to assist victims of CSA in their healing. The term abused boys is more commonly used, and this is due in part to the widely publicized media coverage of male sex abuse in the United States. It is estimated that thousands of boys will be sex abused and they will be scarred and damaged physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Every facet of their lives will be disrupted and marked. As these young men grow into adulthood, they will be inundated with troubled relationships, both personal and intimate, sexual dysfunctions, poor sense of self-worth, and they will find it very difficult to have intimacy with others. Many of these young boys will potentially become drug addicts, alcoholics, and criminals to cope with what has happened to them. At least 1 out of every 10 of men in our country have suffered from trauma as a result of sexual assault. Like women, men who experience sexual assault may suffer from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other emotional problems as a result. However, because men and women have different life experiences due to different gender roles, emotional symptoms following these traumatic experiences can look different in men than they do in women. Abuse in boys. Boys are more likely than girls to be sexually abused by strangers or by authority figures in organizations such as schools, the church, or athletics programs. 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused by the age of 18 years old. Perpetrators often pinpoint boys who are more vulnerable. They assault more. The assaults may occur in isolated areas where help is not readily available. Oftentimes, there's something going on within the home. Homes that there are no male figures around are usually more susceptible. 27.8% of men were aged 10 or younger at the time of their first rape victimization. Boys who are sexually abused at an early age oftentimes become teenage fathers. Abused teens are more likely to engage in sexual risk-taking, putting themselves at greater risk for STDs. Children who are sexually abused oftentimes become involved in drug abuse and alcohol addiction. Types of sexual abuse. Sexual touching of any part of the body, clothed or unclothed, penetrative sex, including penetration of the mouth, vagina, and anus. Encouraging a child to engage in sexual activity, including masturbation. Intentionally engaging in sexual activity in front of a child. Continuing. Showing children pornography or using children to create pornography, sexualized conversation and talks, making fun or ridiculing a child's sexual development, presence, or organs. An adult exposing him or herself to the child for sexual gratification, along with voyeurism. Note the types of abuse. Continuation. Forcing overly rigid rules on dress or overly revealing dress, stripping to hit or spank, or getting sexually excitement out of the hitting. Having a child be sexual with an animal, encouraging a child to engage in prostitution, witnessing others being sexually abused. Myths. These are just some of the few myths that surround men and boys who are victims of sexual violence. Myth number 1, boys and men can't fall victim of sexual abuse. 2, males who are sexually abused will go on to become abusers. 3, all perpetrators of sexual abuse are male. 4, males sexually abused by males are or will become bisexual or gay. 5, if you get an erection or ejaculate during the sexual abuse, you must have enjoyed it. The age-old notion that only gay men would sexually assault men or boys is so far off track. Most male perpetrators identify themselves as heterosexuals and often have consensual sexual relationships with women. Continuation of myths. Number 6, only men who are gay or bisexual can be sexually assaulted. 7, men should be capable of protecting themselves against sexual abuse. 8, if you didn't clearly remember the sexual abuse, it didn't happen. Now, believing these myths keeps those male survivors isolated and alone, making it very difficult for them to reach out and find support they need without being stereotyped and labeled. Individuals have to accept the harsh reality that male sexual violence and abuse does exist in our society, and that the victims must be provided with the same support and understanding available to both women and children. Topic, sexual trauma. How sexual abuse leads to sexual trauma. Sexual abuse teaches victims that their bodies are not really their own. Victims often report feelings such as shame, terror, depression, and guilt, and may blame themselves for the assault. Sexual abuse does not only leave psychological scars. It can also have long-lasting health consequences. The ripple effects of sex abuse. The impact of sexual abuse and trauma. Some of the mental health challenges sufferers of sexual abuse face: anxiety and depression, impaired relationship, low self-esteem, sexual dysfunction and promiscuity, drug addiction, sleep disturbance, suicidal ideation and behavior, anger and fear, masculinity issues, problems with one's sexuality and intimacy, self-blame and guilt, shame and humiliation. How does boys and men respond differently? Men and boys who have been sexually assaulted may experience the same effects of sexual assault as their survivors, and they may face other challenges that are more unique to their experiences. Men who are sexually abused as boys or teens may become differently than men who were sexually assaulted as adults. The only thing that differentiates the responses between boys and men regarding sexual violence usually is age. The stigmas within boys are oftentimes very obvious and too oftentimes neglected. Boys do not have the cognitive skills oftentimes to vocalize or express through words how they are feeling. Boys tend to act out more, yet again, because of socialization and how masculinity is rigidly defined. Many of these behavioral signs will be ignored. Signs within boys ages 0 to 12. Emotional distress, crying, spells, isolation, irritability, nightmares, depressed affect, hypervigilance, changes in eating patterns, sleeping patterns, toiletry issues, bedwetting, severe constipation, clinginess to caregivers, even to an abuser, aggressive behaviors with peers or adults or act out throughout play, preoccupation with touching genitals of others or their own. This behavior is best used as a marker when it is present with other markers. Signs within adult children and younger children. Emotional distress, which is not far different from younger ones, eating disorder, sexual preoccupation, early first intercourse, difficulty with trusting others, somatization, frequent physical illness, irritable bowel symptoms, chronic fatigue symptoms, low self-esteem, substance abuse. Now, how does men respond? While men oftentimes have the cognitive skills to be expressive, societal definition of masculinity and sexuality makes it somewhat challenging to talk about the abuse. Male sexual abuse is still considered a taboo topic in some social respect. In some countries, male sex abuse is criminalized and male victims can be charged as victims and further victimized. Most men find it much easier to self-medicate rather than talking about the abuse, and this has more to do with social and cultural components. Anxiety, depression, fearfulness, or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Drug or alcohol addiction or dependency of both. Withdrawal from relationships or friendships and an increased sense of isolation. Victims can become abusers, physical or sexual. Transformation. The inability to be in a committed, fulfilling relationship, sexual promiscuity, avoiding people or places related to assault or abuse, concerns or questions about one's sexual orientation, fears of the worst happening and or having a sense of shortened future, feeling like less of a man or that you no longer have control over your own body, feeling on edge, being unable to relax, having difficulty sleeping, sense of blame or shame over not being able to stop the assault or abuse, especially if you experienced an erection or ejaculation. The age-old question of how do we break the cycle? The big question that is often asked is, how do we break the cycle? How can our men and boys heal? That's not a very easy question to answer, however. There are no right or wrong answers to this question, as different approaches may work for different individuals. Traditional therapy may work for some survivors, while a non-traditional approach may work for others. For those who choose to take a traditional approach by seeking professional help, it is imperative to encourage providers to recognize the need for cultural competency, which is making a concerted effort to understand the client's place of origin. The most important thing is to give men and boys a safe place to talk about their experience. Oftentimes, self-expression through the arts may work, such as painting, drawing, music, singing, writing, and theater. Others may choose to use different outlets, such as religion, spirituality, and reading books. Healing comes in different ways, and we have to allow the individual survivor to find the best approach that works for them. Now, there's a support group called The Conversation that takes on a more non-traditional approach and allows men to come together and support each other. The groups are run and controlled by survivors who share stories of their personal struggles. The Conversation is run by my organization, the O'Brien Dennis Initiative, and you can simply just do a Google search or go to my website, O'Brien Dennis Initiative. In terms of finding additional resources, recently in revamping the conversation, I met up on this book called Daring Greatly, which is written by Dr. Bernie Brown. This book deals with shame and vulnerability and how to have a personal conversation with oneself. Now, interestingly enough, I guess we're at the end, and this is my picture. Let me go back, I'm so sorry. So this is the picture from the Untold Stories, Men Without Voices, a photo exhibition of male victims of sex abuse. The photograph was taken by Michael Liller Jr. This was our first exhibition on showcasing in picture the ripple effects and how male victims actually deal with and struggle with sexual violence. So this is a picture of myself when I was 30 years old, and in the green picture frame, there's a younger picture of myself and my sister. The picture was taken when I was about 5 years old, I think. Yeah, it's 5 years old. It was at a birthday party that my sister was having. So I know many of you may be asking or wondering what makes me more qualified to be doing this presentation. So this is me. I was first sex abused when I was 5 years old while living in Kingston, Jamaica. And between the ages of 14 to 16 while living in the countryside with my grandmother. And I was sexually abused by a neighbor for 2 years. For years on end, I really didn't understand or fully had a understanding of what depression looked like. However, I started drinking from the age of 18. From the age of 8, I got baptized at 8, thinking that through religion, someone would have changed me, or probably, I use the word God, would have probably given me an answer to why I was drinking or why is it this abuse occurred. I was somewhat functional in school for the most part. I got good grades. Went to college. My first year, I literally flunked every single thing. And I started doing my own independent research. I did seek out therapy. However, the therapist at that time kept encouraging me to go to church. So rather than taking more of an ecological approach and trying to figure where is it I was coming from, my first therapist decided to use religion as a buffer. So I started doing my own independent research when I was about 19 years old in trying to figure how male sex abuse occurred, whether or not there was a correlation between being gay, being bisexual, and the whole reason why that men could be raped by other men. And in that whole struggle, I realized that I struggled with an eating disorder. And the picture that you guys are seeing literally represents me because I'm not at a point where I've recovered from my eating disorder. Unfortunately enough, at the age of 21, I had befriended someone who was also a survivor of sexual abuse, and went out with him and a friend of his, and I was held down and was raped at 21. So a couple of weeks after, I migrated to the United States, and I had then made the pledge never to return back to Jamaica. So coming to America, I was new. I tried going to traditional therapists The first 5 just could not understand where I was coming from the mere fact that they did not understand Jamaica. And so often they kept asking me questions about Bob Marley and reggae music and Jamaican jerk chicken. So I really got somewhat annoyed, and I self-medicated. I continued drinking. By the time I got to 24, my liver was completely destroyed. I was very, very promiscuous. There was a point in time where I had sex for money in order to survive. I struggled with depression. However, I never took medication for the medication for my depressive nature. I was a functional alcoholic. However, when my liver got destroyed at 25, I stopped drinking, continued with the sexual promiscuity, stopped having sex for money. And I was lucky enough to find a therapist. And her husband is Jamaican. So because of that whole cultural dynamics, because she's been to Jamaica before, she was able to take a whole different approach. I've now learned that that approach is called an ecological approach, which in the presentation I spoke about really owning and understanding as providers where your clients are coming from. She really took the time to understand the neighborhood that I was first sex abused, where I was brought up in Jamaica. So it made that conversation and dialogue between the both of us very, very easy. So between 25 to 30, I've written 2 books that dealt with sexual trauma. I completed a master's in public administration because I really had a desire in giving back. So what has really transformed me was because I'd lost so much of my childhood, I decided to go into social services, and I decided to commit myself to working with younger kids. Most of the kids that come into my program have been victims of sexual trauma, and I have been very, very fortunate to live vicariously through most of my kids that have come into my program. And the childhood that I never had, I was really able to give most of my kids that childhood. So I no longer consider myself to be a victim. I'm a survivor. In 2009, I formed the O'Brien Dennis Initiative, and this was out of a need of people constantly asking me about why I wrote the book and why I don't continue to give back more than just writing. So the organization came about with the intention to provide services to men and answer that age-old question of how do they heal, how do they recover, how do they find support. So I've taken a non-traditional approach in creating the conversational group, which is run by men for men. There's a therapist that is there. I recently wrote a training manual with Dr. Kim Ireton, and it literally deals with understanding and working with clinicians in showing and highlighting the signs of childhood sexual trauma, because they are indeed signs. But because social workers, clinicians, and first responders sometimes don't really take the time to really own in and understand what these signs are, the signs usually just pass by very, very easily. So apart from the training and the counseling group that we provide, we have 2 exhibitions, which is the Untold Story and the Ripple Effect. On the 25th of this month at the Schaumburg, we will be showcasing the Ripple Effect photo exhibition. What we have decided to do is we've decided to incorporate women, because we realize that women really play a very pivotal role in the recovery process. As mothers, women are very nurturing. The conversation literally starts at home. Traditionally, we only have conversation with our young girls, and we often neglect our boys. And as they walk into pubescent period, we say that certain behavioral traits are usually geared because they're evolving. Oftentimes, that is not the case. So women are very important in starting that initial conversation with young boys, in showing them the signs and telling them what they can do, what they should not do. And when it comes down to prevention, what we often do is we tell our kids that they need to respect their adults, respect their elders, not fully realizing and understanding, as I said previously in the presentation, over 90% of our kids know their perpetrators. So it now becomes a contradiction. How do you tell the kids that they need to look up to this elder, respect the elder, listen to whatever this elder is saying to them, while this is the same person who is victimizing and abusing them? it brings a certain level of confusion. So parents, mothers have this innate responsibility to say, even if it is your adult male cousin who is touching you, I know you love him, but if that person touches you inappropriately, you need to have a conversation. Wives, girlfriends play a very pivotal role also. Men are sometimes very shameful, very fearful of their reaction when having conversation about sexual abuse. One of the reasons why I introduce Daring Greatly is because it talks about vulnerability and shame. In order for a male survivor to really own it and have an honest conversation about childhood sexual trauma or male rape, they have to first deal with that shame. And in order to deal with that shame, they first have to be in a vulnerable space. If they're with their women, their wives or girlfriends, women need to have that openness and that understanding that when their men start having these open and this very candid conversation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're homosexual or gay. The mere fact that the abuse occurred by another male, there's no correlation between male sex abuse and homosexuality. So in this whole recovery process I've been through, I've learned to forgive myself, and that was the first process in getting to where I'm at. I had to first understand that it is not my fault why is it at 5 years old someone whom I trusted took advantage of me. It is also not my fault that at 14 to 16, my neighbor whom I looked up to for guidance and support took advantage of my vulnerability because, one, my father was not present in my life, and two, I had no male figures around. I continued at 21 to forgive myself for believing that I did something wrong. The person who I had befriended and trusted violated me along with his friend, and I had to forgive myself for the alcohol addiction, my promiscuous lifestyle, and going against my core values for having sex for money. I'm now in a better place. I no longer consider myself to be a victim. I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor simply because I've gotten to a point where I realize that I've used my struggle and my trauma and the journey that I've encountered to become not only a better human being, but to use my story to allow other male victims and survivors to realize and fully understand that if I too can survive, they too can. My mantra is from the Bible, Matthew 5 verses 16. Let your light shine so bright before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So I'm using my life, my past experience as a catalyst, as a tool, so that other survivors, both men and boys, can see within me that light that continues to shine, that I no longer live as a victim, but only as a survivor. So that is it. And thank you guys so much for having me to do this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Tyson. And we're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you still submit questions through the chat box. And our first question is, I have a question. For instance, as you know, you're saying as a parent, I know you was mentioning yourself as being, you was abused and your parent. But as a parent's point of view, and if the child is being abused in a situation with one of his family member or next door neighbor, how do the parents could know that the child is being abused because the child is not actually saying anything to you?
Well, all right. That's a very difficult, challenging question. However, the first thing that parents need to understand, we can't use the word we. Parents should not take responsibility for the abuse. You oftentimes, as parents, allow your child to be in the care of a trusted adult. It is the adult's first responsibility to take care of that child and not to abuse your child. So you cannot take full responsibility for the abuse. It is the abuser who needs to take responsibility. However, as a parent, parents need to be more mindful of changed behaviors within their kids. So let's say it was a young boy who was very, very hyper, and I'm going to use myself as an example. As a very hyper kid, I'm always going out, playing my neighbors, and playing sports. My mom and my cousins told me that when I was very, very younger, I was very, very talkative. No one could get me to stop talking. And they say they realized at one point when I was around 6, going into 7, they realized that I just stopped talking and I stopped playing. These were obvious, visible signs. A boy at 6 to 7 who between 1 to 5 growing up was always hyperactive, always playing, always running up and down, always wanting to play with his peers, always talking and yapping a whole lot, out of nowhere becomes withdrawn. Stop talking, stop playing, just become reserved. No, these are signs which oftentimes we assume that boys getting older, so these are just behavioral changes. While in some regards, there may be behavioral changes occurring, it is the parent's responsibility to ask these questions. So, for example, Johnny, I realize you no longer want to play games with Tommy or Joseph. What's going on? I realize that you usually like baseball and all of a sudden you don't like any kind of sports anymore. What's going on? So it may seem that these are odd questions to ask kids, but it is very, very important. So because the signs are not as obvious as when it comes on to teenagers or males, if parents become more intuitive, more in tune with their kids' behavioral patterns, it becomes somewhat easier to see those signs.
Thank you. There's another part too on my question.
Yes.
How often does a male figure does come out and admit? Because I know us men, we don't talk as much, but admit that it has been abused.
Well, it really ever happens. It took me until I was 21 years old to tell someone. And my reason for not saying anything to anyone, so I did the drinking between age 8 going into probably about 15, 16, up to when I ended high school. I was on an impression that someone could have smelled the alcohol on my breath. No one did. So innately, I was on the impression that while I did not vocalize, while I did not verbally have a conversation with someone, I was drinking. The liquor that was in the house was going down. No one seemed to have asked any question. When I got to a teenager, one of my struggles as a teenager when I was being sex abused, the man who sex abused me, every time there was behavioral issues within the home, my mom called him over to help. And I kept saying to myself, Mommy, Jesus, do you know what he's doing to me? I just did not have the verbal skills in terms of what to say. And there were so many times he came over the home to help, and I was numb. And I was so sheltered. I was like in a box, and I'm like, is my mom realizing that I'm not acting right? I'm just not who I am? But I guess she was so consumed in trying to get as much help. And because she knew for a fact I looked up to this man, she felt that as a male, he was well respected in the community, that he was the ideal person, not fully understanding that he is the actual person who's causing all of my behavioral problems within the household. So for men, because of how we've been socialized and how we've been taught in terms of definition of masculinity and the age-old issue of time and making a connection between male sex abuse and homosexuality is very challenging. Most men will drink their life away before they even say anything. Most men will become abusers, not really sexual abusers, but in traditional heterosexual relationship, they become very, very abusive and aggressive in their relationship, probably hoping that someone will say, you need to get some help, you need to get some therapy. It's oftentimes someone who has to come in and say something to men, for men to come to terms. Yet again, it comes back to that issue of vulnerability. In order for men to have that conversation, they have to feel safe. They have to feel as if they're in a vulnerable environment in order to have that conversation.
Okay, your report that it is a mess that the abuse becoming a perpetrator. Please explain, when did it change for you that this act does not interfere with your intimate relationship?
So that's a two-part question.
Yeah.
So the first one, in all the research that I've been doing, there's little correlation between a man being victimized as a young boy or as a teenager and later on in life becoming a perpetrator. There are cases where that does occur. It occurs in the mere fact that as kids, these are learned behavior. So there are some boys, depending on what developmental stage that the abuse occur, they innately feel that it is okay for them to replicate that behavior with another child. So when it comes on to the perpetrator, it is oftentimes younger boys or teenage boys just replicating that behavioral act that was brought against them against another young man in the household. So while it is wrong, and I'm not trying to find a justification or a correlation, based on empirical data and research and so that has been conducted, there is not a large cross-section of men who are survivors of childhood sexual trauma who later on become victims. I can tell you personally, I could never see myself victimizing somebody. No, to that issue of intimacy and relationships. There's no connection, so I would actually ask permission to have sex with my partner. It doesn't flow as regular men who have not been victimized. For me, there's this innate feeling or urge for me to ask permission because I don't want to violate someone. It brings a lot of conflict in my relationships because oftentimes there's this notion that I've given you all the signs and we've been together for years now, so why don't you think that is okay? I always remember, it always brings me back to that moment where someone took advantage of me. And because I was vulnerable, I remember being abused first at 14. The reason why it happened, I felt that there was a part of me because this man who was helping me and who was my mentor, he was very, very supportive of me in my school. I didn't have a job, didn't have money, so I felt the only thing that I could have offered to him was the sex that he was asking of me to do. So the same thing when it comes down to a relationship. A relationship is not a business. We don't exchange money, we don't give gifts or favors. Sex is a form of an intimate connection that brings a greater bond between both partners. However, for myself, it is very, very difficult. I feel it is best to ask because I don't want to find myself in a predicament where my partner ever feel or have this inkling that I'm actually forcing them to want to engage in any level of intimacy or sexual act with myself. Over the years, I have struggled, however, with being intimate with people. I struggle with just maintaining a relationship. There's a point in time where I believe that if I was not having consistent sex with my partners, that I was not loved. Bear in mind, when sex has been introduced to a young boy, a teenage boy, at a very, very early age, it destroys the definition of what love and intimacy really means. Because when one is loving someone, it should be free, it should be very, very easy, it should flow. And when it comes down to sex, it should not be forced upon them. So it really changes that whole dynamics of what a true relationship should be all about, where it happens naturally. However, for many, many survivors, it doesn't happen that easily, and there's a vulnerability factor where you need to feel vulnerable and feel safe in order to become very intimate. So that's it.
Okay, so I have another question, is how do you propose we change the ways for men and talk to one another, move away from a relationship on women to talk to them?
Okay, how do you propose we change the way men talk to one another, moving away from reliance on women to talk to them? All right. That's not going to be very, very easy. Remember, we're still struggling and grappling with the age-old definition of what masculinity is. So for me to say I'm going to go and meet a gentleman at the bar and trying to have an open-ended conversation, I said, hey, what's going on? I just had 2 drinks not long ago. You know, I was a victim of sex abuse when I was 14. Usually a conversation like that doesn't happen. Let me see. If I had to go back to when I was a young adult, I think being involved in extracurricular activities preferably when we're in the college period, where it is more of an intellectual conversation. No matter what we do, we cannot take women out of this equation. This has nothing to do with gender role, sexual orientation, but women really, because of, and everything really comes back to how we've been socialized, how we've been nurtured, how we define masculinity versus femininity. Too often when I have these conversations, people always say, but so what happens to the homosexual, the LGBT community? I am not dumbing down on the LGBT community because they do have a role to play. Every single person has a role to play. But women are innately, and I'm going to use the word innately because it comes somewhat human. It's natural for women to just be nurtured, to give. And in order for me to get help, I will never go to a male, no matter what happens. And I've known many, many males who are therapists. And most of the men who does research on male sexual violence in America and some overseas, I'm very, very good friends with them. Most are clinicians. And they've always asked me to be a part of their clinical group, and I said, no, I'm not interested. I feel safer having conversations with women. It's just like some women who are victims of sexual trauma, sexual abuse, and rape will tell you that they don't find much comfort having conversation with women. They feel more comfortable having conversation with men. But it's just what it is sometimes. It's not a gender role that we're putting on women, but I'm a firm believer that because women are mothers, they're nurturers, they're the first responders within a household. It's very, very important for them to take on a pivotal role. Yes, the fathers need to take on more responsibility, but it has to take a very strong man, a man who's very comfortable, confident in his skin, has no issues with sexuality, sexual orientation. Yet again, we're still fighting this age-old question of masculinity and sexuality. Whenever I have presentations or even do the photo exhibition, people always say, oh, it's a gay exhibition. It's not. And no matter how much the big headline says, male victims of sexual abuse, male victims of sexual trauma, exhibition on male victims of sexual abuse, most respond is, okay, so I'm going to come and see a group of gay men who have been victims of sexual abuse. It's a struggle.
Okay. Another question that was written up. How you encounter cases where more than one sibling in the same household has been sexually abused, and if so, do you have any suggestion in how to deal with this situation?
Oh. Good question. I've been there before. And as I said, I've been in foster care for over 10 years. And I remember one specific incident where there were literally 3 kids in the household that were being victimized by a family member. The 2 eldest kids of the 3 struggled somewhat to say anything. Mark, they had a conscience because they could have said something, but they just did not believe that anyone in the household had said something. Got to a point is the younger one who decided to say something. And all 3 kids knew what was going on. They had a bond. They were foster kids that were adopted by a foster family. So they themselves went in that home having trust issues. Their big problem was if they said anything, they were going to get removed from the home. So that's the reason why they decided to all bond as 3. The younger one could not say anything. The 2 eldest one did not want to say anything. However, the younger one did talk about it. What I really admired about the dynamics of this Parker household was the foster parent, well, the adoptive parent, believed the younger one immediately. And before going to the perpetrator, who was a trusted family member, she decided to have an open-ended conversation with the 2 other kids. What she did was she provided a safe space for them. She fully understood that they're going to have this notion that if they told on that adult, that there's a possibility that they may believe that they're going to get removed from the home. Yet again, it goes back to that conversation where I was talking about first responders, and providers in having an understanding of the individual that is before you. This adoptive parent was wise enough. I'm assuming she must have probably gone to some training or got some external information in terms of how to deal with kids. This problem could have escalated more by first thing she's saying, I don't believe you. You guys have been gone through years of trauma and abuse outside of my home, so you're now just creating fictitious story to destroy my household. Oftentimes, I've always said to parents, it is best, even if it is your husband, your brother, and even if it is your child, to believe the child first. Let's start doing the investigative work first. You're not going out and putting blame. What she did was she removed that perpetrator from our house. I've been in many, many cases where we had to fight. We've even had to gone to ACS to ask the parents, the caregivers in the home. A case was called in. It's a given sometimes. Kids do lie. They do fabricate stories. It is very important to trust the child from day one. It risks further traumatizing the child, because what if it's a case where the child is indeed telling the truth? Why would you want that adult to be in that home still to continuously victimizing your child? So the first step to do is, one, believe the child. Two, remove that perpetrator from your home. And you're removing them with the greatest level of love, because you really don't know if that is the truth. It is best to bring in the professionals, the people who fully understand how to deal with these levels of trauma. Bear in mind that even the parents sometimes go through their own level of trauma, or believing that I must have done something wrong. It was my responsibility to protect my kids, and I allowed this person to come in. So what parents tend to do oftentimes is they try to focus on themselves, trying to heal them, trying to get over their own shame and guilt, not realizing that as an adult, still, there are 3 kids, and I'm using that example I gave you. Those 3 kids first are your responsibility. They don't have the cognitive skills as adults to deal with certain emotional and internal problems, so we have to address their needs first. So yet again, it comes back to education. It comes back to adults having a better understanding of how to deal with these issues. So based on my experience dealing with clients and children in my over 10 years in foster care, that's how I came up with the training manual. And the training manual is an actual workbook. It's not the traditional manual where you just go up and just have all these open-ended conversations. It's a workbook. It's an engaging conversation from the moment they walk into the training until the end, and I actually give real scenarios, not these fictitious things that came into my head, real examples of what I dealt with, what my staff had to deal with. And people within the group who come to the training really brainstorm and have open-ended, honest conversation. Bear in mind, there's often no right or wrong way of dealing with certain situations when it comes down to child with sexual trauma. However, if you have the resources and have the information really available, it lessens the issues that will arise by not having the right information. Yes, next question.
We're going to take 2 more.
Okay.
Next one. I work at a domestic violence/sexual assault program. Do you have any suggestions for crisis interventions specific to male survivors? For example, during an advocacy in the emergency room for a male client coming in for treatment after his assault.
All right, questions. So the training manual that I created with Dr. Kim Arrington, in the 3rd section, which deals with prevention, we actually engage participants in how to handle that situation. It is more about the right questions to ask. Apart from just allowing the person to feel that they're in a safe space, which will allow them to become more and more vulnerable, it's not walking into that setting and asking these open-ended questions. I'm not sure if most of you probably remember when I said when I got my first set of therapists when I first arrived to America, they kept asking me questions about Jamaica, Bob Marley, the food, and the culture. If it's possible before going in and having a conversation with the victim to kind of probably get a better feel or understanding, try not to dumb down your question on the assault. Leave those questions for later on. Be more empathetic, be more understanding. Don't ask, so why did you go there? who is this person? While those are questions that you need to get answered, those are very, very critical questions, and especially if it's a case where the victim is in a hospital setting and the police are involved. The police are investigating an active crime, so they really do need to get answered. However, it is very important to just ask the right questions. I have partnered up with New York State Alliance in SACA. They're in Albany, New York, and what they were really grateful of doing with us is they gave us a list of questions that first responders should have. So at the end of my training, everybody actually get I think it's a 16-page booklet and a pamphlet of how to engage victims and survivors in conversation and regarding this specific question that get asked as first responders, the kinds of question that needs to get asked, because there are questions that we shouldn't ask, even though it's very important to ask those questions. But there are actual questions that we can ask that really gradually allow the person to feel somewhat safe and feel somewhat comfortable. The training I give also allow responders, including clinicians, social workers, to kind of have a feel when they're asking questions and the reaction that they're getting, when to actually stop. Because there has to be a point in time where you have to realize it's important for me to stop in order to build that trust, and most importantly, to not ask questions that will re-victimize individuals. I remember times doing trainings and being there, people asking me questions, and I'm literally going back there. Mm-hmm. My process of going through therapy have helped me to understand that I've now gone past that. So anyone can ask me questions without giving me those triggers, mm-hmm. but not everyone is at that point. Mm-hmm. Now the last question.
Okay, the last question is, as being as an author, what are the names of your books?
So my first book is The Cries of, I'm closing my eyes to remember, The Cries of Men, Voices of Jamaican Men Who've Been Raped and Sex Abuse. And that is actually my memoir. It is as real and raw as you can get. These are actually my journal entry. Mm. If someone really wants to own into the mind of a teenage boy, a young adult male who's been raped, and what we do, what we go through, our conversation, why we do the things that we do, I will say check out the journal. It's a very tough read because in writing in one's journal, you're going to be very open and candid. There's no holding back. So I've been told many times that there are sections where people have to just put it down, take a couple of days to just breathe, because it's a whole lot. It is human. It's very, very real and raw. The second book is titled Understanding Male Sex Abuse. It's a copy of my thesis. I was very grateful that my master's program allowed me to publish the book. So what I did was I actually went out and did a research with a group of men in getting a better understanding of how to deal with their trauma. And in the process of writing the book, I was very grateful to have conducted a research with the Bronx District Attorney's Office that has a group of clinicians on board that deals with sexual trauma. And you'd be very intriguing to, if you get a copy of the book, to actually see and read the responses that clinician gave. And in reading that section, you realize how important cultural competence is, because many of those clinicians made it very, very clear, I'm just not ready to deal with boys. I don't want to deal with boys, because there's certain jargon, there's certain language that will differ dealing with a boy versus dealing with a girl. And the third book is the training manual that myself and Dr. Kim Arrington wrote. If you want further information on the training manual, I'm very open to go into respective organizations and do training at a small fee. We don't charge a lot of money, but we're open to dialogue and compromise in terms of the fees that we charge. But the training is a full day. It's divided in 3 different sections that talks about the definition of childhood sex abuse, types, forms of childhood sex abuse, and most important, prevention. What is so unique about this training is we first introduced the ACE study. Many people within the clinician profession are more and more getting involved in the ACE study, which really makes it more personal in dealing with trauma. No matter what we do, we can't normalize trauma. And in order for me to allow participants to get a better feel of what trauma is, I allow them in the initial, probably about 45 minutes, to participate in the ACE study. There are 10 questions, and they all answer the questions. And then they realize that they themselves have gone through some level of personal trauma. And by making the issue of trauma personal, it makes it easier to now get into the conversation of how to deal with kids. So you look at myself first. We talk to self first, that I have been there before. So if I was a child, how would I want someone to respond to me? And I found it makes it very, very easy for participants to walk away and having a better feel of how to move forward in asking the right question and how to be more responsive.
Thank you, Mr. Tyson, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, please contact us at ctac.info@nyu.ed. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a service on the presentation, and you will, and we would appreciate if you would complete that to provide us feedback. On behalf of Max Silver, CTAC, MATAC, and our presentation of Mr. Tyson, thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Outstanding.
Even though it was late, right?